episode 7.
Yeah.
So here we are. We've taken a short little... Well, you and I have taken a break. I guess it won't feel like a break for people watching this. But we're pacing our way through, and we're sort of we're starting the second half of the book of Genesis, ultimately. 12 different portions of Genesis. We land in sort of the sort of beginning of chapter number 28. I want to preface this episode with something that I think is quite interesting, which is Esau and his response to Isaac sending Jacob to go and find a wife and to not find one among the Canaanites. And you see that Esau does the exact opposite.
Yeah.
He's like, that's what's going to make you angry. Well, I'm going to go ham on that.
Exactly.
And I'm going to go and find a wife from,
Esau's like, Arameans are for suckers.
Yeah. And so it's quite interesting when you see details presented like that, because I think it gives you some sense of why, there's a famous line in is it Malachi, where God says, Jacob I love, but Esau I hated.
Esau hated, yeah.
Right? And you go, why? What, did you just hate him because you hated him, or is there something more to it? And you see choices like this from Esau actually tells that he wants to rebel against his father. He wants to, if he doesn't get his way, he's going to do the exact opposite, which is destructive. And there was a moment, I guess, where you can even relate this to, again, like this Cain and Abel-esque opportunity. Like Esau could have said, my dad wants me to not marry one of the Canaanites because he's just given Jacob that instruction. Maybe I should do the same, and I can actually honor my father's choices. But he doesn't. He tries to rebel against that. And so I think those little indicators that the Bible author, or Moses gives us gives us a better understanding of like the heart of these characters. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, I think I look at Jacob, and from the very beginning, he wants the blessing, right? He's in pursuit of the blessing, which, you and I will agree, maybe he didn't take the best route to that. But ultimately, what does the blessing come from? The blessing comes from God. And so there is a desire to be closest to that source. And so the difference between those two characters, even in this little detail, kind of stands. And so Jacob obediently leaves Beersheba, and then he's going to make his way to Paddan Aram, which is modern day southern Turkey.
Yeah, basically. So what's fascinating is that there's like this classic essay by a really famous classicist. I believe his name is Eric Auerbach, but the essay is called Odysseus' Scar. And what he does in that essay is he compares storytelling, like ancient Greek storytelling, like in the Iliad or the Odyssey, with biblical storytelling, because they're from like roughly the same period. Mm-hmm. And what he says is that in Greek storytelling, everything is externalized. Like, exactly how everybody's feeling at every moment because it tells you, right? Like Achilles was angry and he felt this and he did this because of that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's just everything you see is what you get. And that really was Greek society. It's just all surface level. Biblical storytelling is much more opaque, but it's much more human. And I think in that respect, mysterious because of that. So what the Bible will do, it will tell you, and so did this and did this and did this and did that. And it's left to you to figure out why. What are the connections? What are the motivations? And sometimes there is no one motivation. Like, think about why any of us do anything. There is a whole mix of emotions that go into that. And so, like, the classic example that he uses in the essay is the binding of Isaac, where the binding of Isaac, it's the story about a father who is asked to sacrifice, who's commanded to sacrifice his son. And we get not a single moment where the Bible tells us, and Abraham felt X. Angry, sad, trepidatious, anxious, that kind of thing. All we get is a series of verbs. And Abraham did this, and he did that, right? And he woke up in the morning, and he saddled his donkey, and he went, and he took Isaac, and he took his, etc. So what's amazing here is that is that with Esau, like there are moments in the Bible where the Bible gives you a little bit of that Greek storytelling as a contrast. So the most famous example is Goliath, right? So Goliath versus David. What's fascinating about Goliath is that if you put the character of Goliath without changing a single word, if you put Goliath in the Iliad on the walls of Troy, right? Or in front of the walls of Troy, he'd be a hero. Again, you wouldn't have to change a word. He sounds exactly like Achilles. He sounds exactly like Ajax. He sounds exactly like Agamemnon. He's braggadocious. He's boasting. He's calling out the gods of the enemies and saying they won't protect you and I'm mightier than you are and I have all this huge armor and he's jacked. You know what I mean? And David is kind of like the reversal of that, right? So Esau is another character where Esau is like Goliath. He's almost like a Greek, like ancient Greek Homeric stereotype where it's like all surface, right? Esau just tells you what he thinks all the time. And he came back from the field and he was hungry. And so he said to Jacob, I just want something to eat. And Jacob has all of these, machinations going on and all of these, and this kind of youthful plot to, as it were, steal a blessing, right? Or steal a birthright. And it's not even clear that that's possible, right? And the rest of the story suggests that actually it's not possible. Jacob failed in that. God blesses him anyway, but not because he pilfered it from Esau. But Jacob, you're kind of left to wonder, what is he up to? What is he thinking? He's this like complex figure. And Esau is just like a boor, right? He's just this fully external person. And where I think that leaves us, to your point, is that Esau is a character where it's either going to be all good or it's going to be all bad, right? So there are times where Esau is just going to fully give in to his rage and he's going to say, I want to kill Jacob. I want to marry this person. I don't care what my parents think. And it's pretty like, it's not subtle, right? Let's put it that way. And then there are other times where when he sees Jacob, as we'll talk about a little, in the next episode, he kisses Jacob and he's happy to see him. Like with Esau, you're always hot or cold. And so I think it's not a mistake that Esau and his descendants will provoke some of the most extreme emotions in the Bible, right? So Esau's most infamous descendant, is, Amalek, right? Are the Amalekites. And they're like the archetypes of evil in the Bible. These are people who like slaughter women and children for literally for no reason. That's Esau, right? Esau is just like the extremes of hatred. And at the same time, in Deuteronomy, God, through Moses, commands the Israelites, don't abhor Edomites, right? Namely the descendants of Esau, ki achichahu, because they're in Hebrew, in English, that means because they're your brother, right? And so it's that kind of push and pull between brotherly love and just abominable hatred that I think gives us a sense of when you live in a culture like the one we live in, which is so literal and so surface, right? Where if you want something, you can get it. Like instant gratification is the hallmark of our era. That's where Esau is really comfortable. Like it's totally unsubtle. And part of what makes Jacob so interesting, particularly today, is Jacob's mysterious. Like Jacob is wrestling quite literally. Well, that's like what ends up becoming, his alternative name, Israel. But Jacob is wrestling with faith, with doubt. He's wrestling with sibling rivalry, with jealousy, with a sense of inferiority, the lack of confidence. And eventually, he's literally fighting against people who are seeking to trick him or who are seeking to take advantage of him. And Jacob, in that respect, I think is one of the most relatable characters because he fails, right? Jacob's not a perfect character, and but he's complex. In that respect, I think it's, in many respects, that makes Jacob, I think, the most modern character. There's so much depth to him. That's why getting into his story, I think, is going to be amazing.
Yeah, and I mean, also just the idea that, like, we have Abraham, who's like, this father figure who comes from the place where Jacob's going to go to, and now we have, we had Isaac staying in the land,
yep.
And then we have Jacob leaving the land, ultimately to return. And so he goes on his journey. He ends up in a place that we'll know as Bethel, which in the Hebrew is the house of God, and he has this dream, and so we kind of track the stories of these figures, and we look at Abraham, and really Abraham's journey was all about the unseen realm, right? That he couldn't see. He was just given a series of promises by God. God would meet with it and visit him, and he was quite literally not really seeing or being exposed to that spiritual world besides the encounter with, I'd say, the angels before Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Isaac doesn't really get any sort of deep interaction with God. He has, I think God is the first time someone says, I am with you is Isaac. Jacob will be the second person where God says, I am with you. But Jacob has this dream, and he sees this stairway to heaven, this ladder, where he sees angels ascending and descending. And it's the first time that a biblical character gets to see the connection between the physical and the spiritual world coming together. And at the top of the ladder, he sees Adonai standing at the top of the ladder, and he has a conversation with him, right? And so God says, I am Adonai, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your seed. Your seed will be as the dust of the land, and you will burst forth to the west and to the east and to the north, and to the south, and all the families on earth will be blessed, and in your seed. Behold, I am with you. I will watch over you. Wherever you go, I will bring you back to this land, and I will not forsake you until I have done what I have promised. So God doubles down on his promises that he declares to Abraham and Isaac about land, about a people. But then he goes further and says that I'm going to be with you and I'm going to bring you back into the land. So it's like day one of the journey, he says, yeah, you're going to be coming back. And in Jacob's eyes, he goes, I have no idea when that's going to happen, but there's a promise that's been made. And God obviously, confirms that he will not forsake Jacob until all the things that he has said have come to pass.
By the way, I've had for years now, I've had a question. I confess I don't have an answer to it. Mm-hmm. I'm curious what you think. For years, I remember reading the story, and in my head, and I think in the head of someone who just reads, who's familiar with the narrative, what happens is Jacob is on his way out of the land. His father sent him away, ostensibly to go find a wife, but also to be safe from Esau. Mm-hmm. And in the way that we kind of remember the story is that as he's getting to the border, right? So the angels that kind of protect him in the Holy Land are leaving, and the angels that are going to protect him outside of the Holy Land in Asia Minor and southern Turkey, they're coming down to greet him, and it's sort of like the toll booth on your way out of the Holy Land. But the strange thing is, once you actually if you go to the Holy Land, so you can see where Bethel is, mm-hmm. right? It's modern day Beitin. It's basically the center of the country. Mm. It's nowhere near any of the borders. It's certainly not near, if Jacob is traveling to the north, which is where he's traveling.
It's almost dead in the center.
It's literally dead in the center,
yeah.
right? So it's not like he reaches the edge of the borders of the Holy Land and now he sees this vision. Mm. He walks halfway or a third up the country from Beersheba, and then he has this vision in the middle of the Holy Land. And then he still has a few days of travel to get out of the Holy Land. Mm-hmm. So why does he have this vision here? What is the symbolism of the fact? Is it, and the truth is I don't have a good answer. Is it that intentions matter, right? As soon as Jacob intended to leave, right? Isaac never intended to go anywhere. Isaac made it his business to stay in the land that his father had worked so hard to get to. And that was kind of his tribute to his father Abraham. Jacob is more imitating his grandfather Abraham. And like you said, he's going on that long journey. So as soon as it's kind of like repeating the story of Abraham in a sense, where Abraham has this vision, has this encounter with God in Genesis 12, Gen 12, at the beginning of his journey. And maybe that's why Jacob has this encounter at the beginning of his journey, but I don't know. He has this encounter with God where God's like, goodbye, mm-hmm. Goodbye for now, we'll bring you back. He has it literally at the very beginning of the journey in the middle of the country. I don't know why.
Well, I think there's what I would like to put into that is that there's a bookend now, right? There's two bookends, and you've got whatever happens between this moment and the moment where you return to this place. Now God gets the glory of whatever goes on in that circumstance. And so, for me, I see this as God's way of saying, okay, this is day one. And you have no idea how many days this is going to be. We'll realize that ultimately it's going to be a 20-year journey. But whatever happens from this moment where I declare you that I'm going to be with you, and to the moment you come back, everything that happens now falls into God's sovereignty. And so
that's beautiful, especially because what's going to happen is going to be sometimes amazing, but sometimes painful.
Sometimes painful, but at the same time, all things work out for the good of God's glory, right? For those who love him. And so I see this as God's way of saying, now you know that I'm with you. By the time you get back here, you're going to know that everything happened, whether you understood it or not, was because of my divine providence and sovereignty for your good purposes. Because we have a Jacob that's leaving, but we have a Jacob that's a trickster who's deceived his brother. He's at odds with his father. He's at odds with his family. He's going to be disconnected from his mother, and he's a single man. So there's a lot of questions over Jacob's life and what that is really going to look like. And so this is really for Jacob an opportunity for him to see okay, so whatever happens next is now part of God's journey, and I can't take any glory for that of my own, because God's already marking this as the beginning of a journey. Because the I am with you statement will actually even keep coming up throughout the Tanakh. It'll become a pivotal statement. Like I said, the first person that God said that I'm with you is to Isaac. Then he says it to Jacob. He says it to Moses. He says it to Joshua when he's entering into the land when Moses has died. He says it to Gideon. And then throughout the text, we'll find that in, the Psalms, Deuteronomy,
Isaiah,
Jeremiah exactly.
Yeah.
This will be the statement that will actually become a powerful statement for all those who believe in God. The children of Israel will have to consistently be reminded of this promise that God made individually to Jacob, but it seems like a universal promise to all those who are on a journey like Jacob to discover who they truly should become. And obviously, the climax of Jacob's story, which we'll get to, is a name change, a new identity ultimately given. For Christians, it's also an interesting look, because Jesus will make a very similar statement in Matthew 28:20, where he says to his disciples, and I'm with you till the end of this age. And so the idea of doing a journey, not being alone, having the idea that God is with you in the journey, even though you don't fully understand the road, the path, the details, or the destination, God is making a very, very strong claim that from this moment forward, this journey is my journey with you, and I am your companion. And so Jacob will now have to wrestle with that. Now, in this moment, he turns what was a stone pillow into a pillar and anoints it with oil as a marker moment. What I love about the end of chapter 28 is then Jacob makes a statement. In the English, I don't know if it's as strong in the Hebrew, and I want you to tell me if the is quite challenging in the English, because it says, "If God will be with me and watch over me on this way, I am going where I am going, provide food for me to eat and clothes for me to wear, and I will return in peace to my father's house. Then Adonai will be my God. So this stone which I set up as a memorial stone will become God's house, and everything you provide me, I will definitely give a tenth of it to you." But the if, it's almost like, well, the first thing I'd say is God doesn't ask him for a tenth. This is Jacob's idea, which I actually think is really, really beautiful, because he's had a profound moment with God, and he said, okay, well, if you're going to do all these things, then there's a human desire to want to give back, because I think Jacob in this moment is realizing, well, that's a pretty amazing offer. You've doubled down on the land, you've doubled down on the promise of descendants, but also you said you're going to protect me. So I feel almost obliged to want to do something back. Now, I give a tenth of everything I have. Well, that sounds very similar to Abraham.
Yep.
when he comes back and he meets with this interesting figure, Melchizedek, in Salem, which is modern-day Jerusalem, and he gives a tenth of his spoils. And so is this a lesson that Jacob is learning? Is this something that Jacob has a desire to actually give back to God, realizing that God so graciously wanted to give him something without any condition on top of that?
What's really fascinating, and it actually just occurred to me, I'd never thought of this before, but the language, that language comes back again. So how does the Bible describe in Hebrew what Jacob promises to God? So as you said, in verse 28, it's, and this rock that I make into a monument, this will be the house of God, and from everything that he gives me, I will give him a tenth. So the language that means I will give him a tenth is aser aserenu, which means I will. It's kind of like this is a very common phenomenon in biblical Hebrew where it'll like repeat a verb twice to emphasize how serious the statement is. Either it's a threat or it's a promise or something like that. So aser aserenu literally means I will tenthify the tenth that I will give you, right? So that double language of aser comes back again, almost word for word, in Deuteronomy 14. Deuteronomy 14:22 begins, and this is describing what will happen when the Israelites, as they're standing in the plains of Moab, as they're about to cross over the Jordan River to go back into the land, the children of Israel, like literally the children of Jacob, what is the promise that the promise that God holds them to? It says, aser ta aser et kol tevuat zarecha. You will give a tenth of all of the produce that comes out of the land of Israel. So it's that moment where, as Jacob is on the way out, he makes a promise to God of, I'll give you a tenth of everything that I gave you. That exact language. And so far as I know, this may be the only other place in the Bible where it's used. I'd have to look that up, but I can't think of any other places where this appears. This may be the only two places. As his descendants are now coming back into the land of Israel, bringing that promise, that covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob full circle, God says, by the way, I remember the promise that Jacob made. And to me, it's such a, on the one hand, it imposes an obligation or responsibility, but it's such a comforting moment where God says, by the way, a promise that your ancestor made to me hundreds of years ago, I'm still faithful to that promise. I remember it. And I'm going to hold you to your end of the bargain, but that means I'm going to keep my end of the bargain as well. And it's just this amazing ability to, it's this amazing moment where when you read the text, you begin to realize, yes, it's actually not only possible, but required of us to understand ourselves as part of a generations long story that's moving. And the other piece of that, by the way, is that when we think of our own kind of personal development, whether it's moral development, spiritual development, financial development, we've kind of been convinced by classical storytelling, whether it's movies, TV, novels, whatever it is, that you're always kind of on like this journey up, right? And yeah, there'll be speed bumps along the way. It's not like a smooth linear line, but you get a bad job out of high school, and then you get a little bit of a better job, and then you get promoted, and then you meet somebody, and maybe you break up, and then you meet somebody better, right? And what happens in the biblical story is actually so much seemingly worse than that, right? Abraham journeys from, like, if I think I said this on a previous episode, but you can only read a book for the first time once, right? So you would imagine, if you've never read the Bible before, you read about Abraham's journey in Genesis 12, he leaves Mesopotamia, and you're like, yep, this is the end. Like, we're never going to see Mesopotamia again, right? We're done with Mesopotamia. Now we're in Canaan. Now we're in the Holy Land. And yet, what happened? And like with, in Isaac's generation, yeah, Isaac stays in Canaan and has all of his experiences there. Now, what you would expect from Jacob is, okay, sure, Jacob's going to have some adventures, but he'll have adventures in Canaan, right? Nope. He goes back to Mesopotamia, back to the very, very beginning of the journey where Abraham comes from. It's like you're fully back to square one. He could have been forgiven for completely despairing. But like you said, what was the crucial difference in Jacob's thinking? God made a promise. From the very first step, it's like what you were saying about Bethel. From the very first second that Jacob walks, like not even leaves the land, but intends to go on a journey, from the very beginning of that journey, God makes a promise and Jacob relies on it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, who are listening to this episode, if you're sitting here now, track back and think about the first moment where God came to you. Because I think a lot of people have that moment where they felt like they had this, divine illumination that there was something that was for them in life. It was a marker moment that they may remember. It could have come out of tragedy. It could have come out of success. It could have come out of a quiet moment by yourself on a various journey, or if something even in your childhood where you felt like God was with you. And I think a lot of people could probably relate to that moment of time where they're like, oh yeah, I remember that moment where I really, really felt God's voice or his presence in my life. And somewhere along the way, I've lost that, or somewhere or somehow I've forgotten about that. Because as we track through Jacob's journey, it's going to look like there's moments where it's like, well, where's God? Like, that's not working out like as ideally as someone would like it. Or that's especially when we get to, the relationships with Leah and Rachel and his uncle who's a greater deceiver than he is. You're going to be like, oh, where's God? But the truth is, God started this relationship and everything was actually there to benefit him. What I love about Jacob before he leaves also is the simplicity of his gratitude. He says, I'm going to thank God for for providing me with food, clothes, and more importantly, returning me in peace to my father's house. And I think from a spiritual point of view, I think that's really, really important, because what is life all about? It's eating, it's drinking, it's being joyful. But at the end of the day, if we look at it on a greater spiritual level, the ultimate place that all people want to get to is to a place of peace. And what does the Father's house represent? Jesus talks about, do not worry about what you'll wear or what you'll eat. But he actually makes a suggestion to those listening to him on the Sermon on the Mount. He says, first seek the kingdom of heaven and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. And I think Jacob's story here is he's seeking something greater than himself, because his dad's actually sent him on a journey to find a wife, which will ultimately pave the way for generations upon generations of people, which will make up this nation of Israel. Now, in that moment, he doesn't even realize that the very nation of Israel is going to be called after him. Like, God's got big plans for him, and he's so simple in his thinking, where it's like, I'll just be happy if I have food, if I have some clothes, and you bring me back to my father's house. He doesn't even say, well, hey, also the wife thing, because that's kind of why I'm going. It's as long as I get back into this place of peace in my father's house, then yeah, I'm going to give 1/10 of what I have.
By the way, you know what that reminds me of? So in the rabbinic tradition, there's like a great significance to this moment. The moment of Bethel, there's actually like a really there's like a rabbinic tradition that like everyone learns when you're a kid, right? Like all my kids, like they wouldn't know why the tradition is this way, but they would know it. Mm-hmm. The tradition is that when Jacob laid down to go to sleep in the place that would have eventually become Bethel, mm-hmm. he has a bunch of stones under his head that he's using as a pillow. And then overnight there's a miracle and all the stones fuse into one stone. And so the pillow is more comfortable. And then after he has this dream, that stone becomes the monument that he uses. Where the heck does that tradition come from? Actually comes from, it's actually like a very clever play on words that the rabbis are noticing in the Hebrew, mm-hmm. which is that in verse, in 28:11, when it says that Jacob lay down to sleep, it says, and he took the stones of that place and put it under his head.
Which is, it's odd. Why would you sleep on a stone, right?
Yeah, like super uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Right? but it uses the plural, me'avnei hamakom. It says he takes stones and puts them under his head. And then later in verse 18, it says, and Jacob woke in the morning and he took the stone, ha'even, singular, that he had put under his head, and he made it into a monument, right? So the rabbinic tradition is like, wait, before, when he fell asleep, it was stones, plural. When he woke up, it was one stone. It must be there was a miracle they fused into one. It's like a clever play on words. Like the truth is, this is just like how biblical Hebrew works. It's poetic, but it's like a very clever thing. But the reason, the deeper point, because all these ancient traditions are noticing something really deep within the text. And what they're noticing here is that this is a place of wonders, but it's also a place of mystery, in the sense that not everything that happens in this place is good, right? So this is where the audience is going to see like Super Nate. What's the most infamous thing in the Bible that happens at Bethel?
Well, yeah, Jeroboam.
Yeah.
First, Jeroboam, number one, builds the golden calf,
Kapow.
which is like, come on, bro, read your Bible. This didn't end well for a lot of Israelites,
exactly.
In the Sinai desert. But he builds an altar. He practices false worship, which is by far the worst thing you can do.
Yep.
You go through the text and you see that God is very much against the idea of idol worship, false gods. It's the first commandment that there's no other gods besides me. And so
that's a pretty big one in the Bible.
So Jeroboam goes out there and he builds it in a place.
Just to set the stage, by the way, so King Jeroboam, first book of Kings, you have King Saul is sort of like a false start. After Saul, Samuel anoints David. David becomes the king whose dynasty ends up as king of the Israelites for essentially 400 years. I
forget that people might not know the kings as well.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying.
Good point.
Like you're Superman. I'm just Batman. I just have a utility belt.
Yeah, they're like, who's Jeroboam? Someone you could just hear this. Someone flicking through their Bible trying to find it. Yes,
exactly. It's like It's like they're no like Dougs, Matts, and you know what I mean? Like they're just Jeroboams, right? Like
Jeroboam and Rehoboam.
Exactly. So David becomes the king. His son Solomon takes over after him. After Solomon's son Rehoboam takes over. And Rehoboam is like this ineffectual king, whereas Solomon was in some ways, in many ways, a failure as a king, especially by the end of his life. He at the very least was this charismatic, politically savvy, diplomatically genius figure. His son has none of those good qualities, and he's like a weak, capricious man. And Rehoboam ends up kind of bringing a bunch of Nepo babies to court and empowering all of them.
Good way to put it.
Right. And empowering all of them. And so what God ordains is that Jeroboam, this kind of figure from the north, Jeroboam will be able to split the kingdom in two. This is sort of a punishment on Rehoboam and the house of David for mismanaging the kingdom. So Jeroboam splits the kingdom at God's prediction as conveyed to him by a man of God, by a prophet. But what the prophet warns is that don't think that Jeroboam is so righteous because he's fulfilling God's will. Jeroboam himself has demons. And in fact, quite literally. So Jeroboam ends up, as part of his coup and part of his attempt to distract from the centrality of Jerusalem and the temple at Jerusalem that was within the territory of King Rehoboam of the southern kingdom. So he moves his capital to the north. That becomes the northern kingdom. And Jeroboam, as a way of showing the importance of his kingdom, sets up a golden calf, one in the territory of Dan all the way in the north, and then he sets up a golden calf at Bethel, which
is odd because he got a word from the prophet that God would be with him in this new kingdom, and yet instantly just goes off and does the worst thing you could possibly do.
But to me, like, think about that for a moment. Just again, this is such a trivial example, but it's one I think people can relate to. So like, you guys can all see Nate if you're watching on YouTube. Nate's a good-looking dude. I am the opposite of that, right? So,
yeah, that's not true.
I'm in shape, but the shape is a circle. That's a shape, right? So like, how many times in my life have I started a diet successfully, right? And you lose 10 pounds, maybe even 20 pounds. And then at a certain point, you have one setback, and all of a sudden, you're back up 20 pounds again, right? And that's that feeling of, it's one thing to like lose 20 pounds, and then you gain 5 and you're net down 15. But to go back up, like there's nothing more defeating than that moment where you step on the scale and you're like, ugh, everything I've done for the last 4 months was for nothing, right? And there's so many more powerful examples of that, right? It could be, I remember when my grandmother, when I was a kid, when I was in high school, when I was even younger than that, even my grandmother was diagnosed with cancer, ovarian cancer. And eventually she goes into remission and it's all good. And then it comes back and it's worse than ever. And ultimately it killed her. And that moment, I remember being in high school where I was like just getting mature enough to understand this kind of thing. That feeling of, we're back worse than square one. Like we're all the way back where things started is so defeating. it can put you off from trying to achieve anything at all. It just saps the ambition from you. It saps the noble aspiration from you. So think about Jacob. Like Abraham had fled Mesopotamia and he'd made a home in the land of God's promise. And Jacob, not only is he moving away from that vision, he's back where Abraham started. He's back in Mesopotamia. And the place that symbolizes that journey, Bethel, right? Bethel's the place where God's angels descend to earth, where God is standing over Jacob, and Jacob has this sublime. Now, fast forward to the time of Jeroboam. Jeroboam sets up a golden calf in Bethel. The worst thing that you could do. It's the arch sin from the book of Exodus. And you could be forgiven whether you're Jacob going back to Mesopotamia, whether you're an Israelite just trying to serve God and watching Jeroboam doing what he's doing at Bethel. And you're thinking to yourself, we lost 20 pounds, then we gained 25 back. And we're worse than when we started. Why even try? Why even try to do anything? And that's what makes the Bible to me so real. It's not a hero's journey. It's not Odysseus making his way back home and everyone lives happily ever after. It's not Heracles passing all the tests and clearing out the stables and all that, and finally reaching the constellations. It's a story about people who sometimes experience great success and blessing, other times engage in terrifying, terrible sin, and other times are just experiencing failure after failure after failure. Some have happy endings and some don't. And the overarching goal of it all is the Bible's not out to convince you that life is perfect, notwithstanding evidence to the contrary. The goal is to convince you that you're part of a story. So first of all, the story doesn't begin and end with you. If you experience a failure, if you experience a setback, that's one chapter, number one. Number two, everybody else depends on you, right? So Jacob could have given up for Jacob's sake, right? An Israelite in the time of Jeroboam could have given up for his own sake. Like he could have given up on himself. There's nothing wrong with giving up on yourself. But if you have an opportunity to, notwithstanding the challenges that you face, to bequeath something better to a new generation or to a friend or to a sibling, to a parent, to a child. So your life's not just your own. Your life, in some ways, belongs to those around you whom you love and whom you care for. And finally, remembering that through this entire journey, as difficult as it is, as difficult as it sometimes may be, God's with you in that moment. I literally will never forget my grandfather after my grandmother passed away. My mom's father, my mom's mother. His whole life was prayer. His whole life continues to be prayer. Like my grandfather now, however much decline he experiences in his life, the thing that he structures his entire day around is just prayer. It's unbelievable. And when my grandmother was sick, that was when he really discovered prayer. And I remember thinking, his prayers weren't answered, right? God took my grandmother from us. And I remember having a small moment of doubt after my grandmother passed away. Okay, what's going to become of my grandfather's prayer now? It's all pointless, right? It became more powerful for him, more real for him, because the ability to embrace the notion that, as he often put it, prayer is not a monologue. It's a dialogue, right? It's not me just asking for stuff and telling God stuff and someone either takes my order or they don't take my order. It's actually the ability to have a conversation with the source and the origin of all meaning that makes all of this in some way worth it. And that's what Jacob has. It's not just a ladder, and this is something the Jewish tradition emphasizes very strongly, the rabbinic tradition in particular. It's not a one-way ladder that comes down in Bethel. It's a two-way ladder. It's a ladder going up and a ladder going down, and angels are traveling up it and angels are descending it, because prayer is a dialogue.
And it reveals the access that is available to God. I like that the author has presented that Jacob laid his head on a stone, because you instantly go, that's not comfortable.
Right.
And you should. It's
Yeah.
not comfortable. He's not in a comfortable situation. He's leaving his home. He has no idea where he's going. And in that moment of time where he's laying his head in a very uncomfortable way, he sees something where he says, I actually have access to God. There's a spiritual realm where there's angels coming down and angels going up. And so the question remains, how do I keep connection to the access that's been made available to me, through
Right.
God?
Just because you've gone backwards on the journey doesn't mean you're not on the journey anymore.
Yeah.
Going backwards is part of the journey.
Yeah. So the reality is that there is a spiritual world and there's a physical world, and there is a connection between the two. But you connecting to that access point is really, really up to you and the choices that you make. Jacob makes a clear choice. He says, well, now that I've seen this stairway, I'm going to choose to stay connected to the access point, who is God. And so I think that is also a really, really powerful reminder that there is access to God. The question is, will you stay connected to it? And throughout Jacob's story, we see that. There's one thing that I kind of, we look at, what's going to happen over the next few chapters. We've got a lot to talk
Oh my
about.
God. We got like
Yeah, this could be either a really
3
long
sentences
episode, or
in.
you're going to be left without hearing a lot of things that we were supposed to talk about. So let's fast forward to the fact that Jacob shows up. He sees a beautiful Rachel. Right? I love how the Bible's always like Sarah, beautiful.
Yeah.
Like Rebecca, beautiful. Rachel, beautiful.
All right.
Leah.
Esther. Oh, and Leah, right.
Leah. Is it as savage in the Hebrew as it is in the English? What does it mean by like the eyes statement that is made about Leah, that she had does it say lazy eyes?
Yeah, so it literally says, it says Ve'enei Leah rakot, right? This is 29:17. Ve'enei Leah rakot, and Leah's eyes were literally means soft.
Soft.
So
Yeah.
it could mean she had a lazy eye. So there's actually an ancient rabbinic tradition, 2,000 years old, that reads that verse, because another way to interpret that description, particularly in later Hebrew, is that it means she was crying. And why was she crying? And the tradition goes that, well,
She was single.
she was single, right? Well, it's actually, interestingly, the tradition is that, well, there are 2 siblings, right? 2 siblings here in Paddan Aram, and 2 siblings in Canaan. There's Leah and Rachel, older and younger, and there's Esau and Jacob, older and younger. And you would assume older goes with older, younger goes with younger. Jacob's already met Rachel. They hit it off just fine. So Leah's like, well, who am I stuck with? Esau. And she wasn't psyched about it. And I think the deeper point of that tradition is that Leah is actually already thinking covenantally long before anybody else. Like, Rachel is just caught up in a love story. And so is Jacob. Leah is already thinking in terms of her destiny. Who am I going to end up with, and what does that mean for me? And you see throughout the rest of the narrative, Leah is always the one thinking covenantally. Leah sees the larger picture much more than anyone else, including Jacob.
Yeah, and she's also very much like Ruth-esque in the sense that she has a faithfulness to Jacob's God more than any other character in this narrative. Laban's
100%.
got idol, household idols.
Right.
Rachel is just
This amazing collection of like vintage idols,
Yeah. Welcome to my idol room.
Right.
Make yourself at home.
It's like the OG man cave,
Right.
like-
just household idols.
Asherahs and Baals,
But Leah has a real interesting relationship with God, which I appreciate, and I think often goes unnoticed, because we're sort of tracking Jacob's story. We're seeing the love story, and we kind of go, okay, well, he really, really wanted Rachel, so he works 7 years for her. Laban gives the older first, and Jacob now gets deceived, which is also, I think, fitting because, often you ask, well, that's not fair. Jacob, deceived his brother out of his his birthright per se. He was dishonest about getting this blessing. And is God just going to allow that to happen? And what you actually see is now Jacob is going to get a taste of his own medicine, and it's actually going to be, tenfold really of what, Esau experienced, because he's going to be committed to this place for 20 years, as he says to Laban, 7 years for Rachel, gets Leah, works another 7 years to get, his first love, which is Rachel, and then he works another 6 years before saying enough is enough. I need to go. And so Jacob's deceptive ways, now he gets the experience of what it's like to be on the other end of that. But throughout that story, as we're tracking with Jacob, we see Leah's faithfulness, we see her loneliness, and I think a lot of people can in some ways relate to this character, Leah, who's kind of always considered second best to the world. But it seems she's really, really favored by God. She's the one who's going to be the mother of Levi, of Judah, who's ultimately going to bring about kings to the nation of Israel. So she gets these incredible generational blessings. And also, ultimately, she's going to be the one who's going to be buried with Jacob, not Rachel. Rachel will die giving birth to Benjamin on their return. But it's actually Leah who's going to be put in Machpelah, where Jacob and Isaac and Rebekah and Abraham and Sarah are buried today, in modern day Hebron, which is kind of incredible because she receives these incredible blessings from God, but in the moment of her story, she never saw that, never realized that.
This is just another example of the Bible subverting every single storytelling trope that would have been familiar to anybody in the world at this time. So first of all, this is a story, again, if you've never read the Bible before and you read this for the first time, you are so primed to see what's coming. If you've ever read a classic love story from any civilization, you know what's coming, right? It's a meet cute. This is the first meet cute, right? Jacob meets Rachel at a well. It's love at first sight. She's beautiful, and they fall in love, and they have their first kiss, and literally, it's like out of a movie. And then they meet the evil father-in-law, or not even evil, just the devious father-in-law. And this is Jacob's a trickster, but he's in the championship league. He's in League One, right? Laban is Premier League tricksterdom, right? He knows what he's doing. Jacob's a rookie, right? So Laban's oh, you're a trickster? Let me show you how it's done. And he tricks Jacob, and now there's an obstacle in the way of him ending up with the woman he loves. And in typical storytelling, we're used to that obstacle being the thing that the hero overcomes to get, so that the prince and the princess end up together. And what the Bible does, and it's unbelievable how hard the Bible commits to the bit. The Bible takes that obstacle, that thing that was in the way of true love, and says, no, actually, this is going to be the main focus for the literal rest of the Bible, right? Leah is going to be the one who is the progenitor of Judah, who actually gives Judah his name, which ends up becoming the origin for the name of the Jewish people. She is the one who actually, as you said, is buried side by side with Jacob in Machpelah and Hebron. To this day, you can go see her gravesite,
which is wild. I mean, that's one thing people don't realize. The location of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob and Leah is a known location.
It's unreal.
That can be visited today. And when we're talking about biblical figures that lived, some 4,000 years ago.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And we know where they're buried, and you can visit that place. It was, I guess refurbished by Herod the Great, who was an Edomite.
Right.
So he comes from the line of Esau, who was a Jewish convert and basically put in power by the Roman Empire. But he refurbishes this tomb site, which is now called the Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron. I've been there many times, and it's almost near impossible to connect to the reality that you're going to the place where these figures that you've heard so much about, read about, who are foundational into the story of God, are buried today. Out of all the people that God decided to allow us to have access to their tomb sites, this was significant to God. And I think that's really pivotal, because God will define himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so being able to go to those places and actually see that and experience it, and going to the tomb of Leah and thinking, wow, she made it.
Yeah.
Like she got where, ultimately she got where she wanted to be, which is by Jacob's side to some degree.
It's like the ultimate expression of the stone that the builders despised ends up becoming the cornerstone.
Mm-hmm.
She suffers. Like she truly suffers. The Bible says, like the Bible literally says in 29:33, Genesis 29:33, that Leah is hated. Like she's hated in this marriage. And she's never
And she's the most least problematic.
Yeah, right.
Ultimately.
She's just straightforwardly like the best.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she never ultimately never seems to like reconcile with her husband, kind of. It's not clear what her relationship is with her sister. Like the rabbinic tradition kind of goes into depth on this and portrays their relationship as actually ultimately a loving one, but with on the surface of the text itself, it seems to be kind of tense. And again, she's like the obstacle. She's like the thing you need to kick out of. Leah's the kind of thing you need to kick out of the way so that the hero and the heroine can kind of find each other in the end. It's amazing that the Bible says, no, that's the person whose story we're going to follow. We're going to follow the story of her descendants. And by the way, the Bible, before we're introduced to Leah's marriage to Jacob, we're given all this foreshadowing of Joseph, actually. So it's like very subtle. But for example, in Genesis 29:17, right, which we talked about earlier, when it says that Leah had soft eyes, whatever that means, it says, and Rachel was in the Hebrew, it says Yifat Toar v'Yifat Mareh, which means I'm curious how it translates it there.
18. Jacob was in love with Rachel, so he said, "Let me serve you."
In verse 17.
Oh, 17. Sorry. Leah's eyes were delicate, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance.
Right. Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. So I'm curious if you go ahead to if you skip ahead to Genesis 39:6. Right? So it says Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. What does it say in Genesis 39:6? Just to set up the background. This is the story of Joseph in the house of Potiphar.
Yeah, so he released everything he owned into Joseph's hand. With him in charge, he did not think about anything except the food he ate. Is that right?
Yep.
Now Joseph was handsome in form and handsome in appearance.
Boom. So it exchanges handsome for beautiful.
Yeah.
But that's just an English translation thing. The Hebrew is literally exactly identical. Exactly identical. So the very first time we meet Rachel, it describes her, in Hebrew it's Yifei Toar v'Yifei Mareh. It describes Rachel with the exact same words that it will later describe Joseph. And then if you go down to Genesis 29:22, and it says, and Laban gathered all the people of his place, and he made a feast.
Yep.
Right. So the word that it uses for and Laban gathered is Vaye'asof, which is the same root. It sounds almost identical to the name of Joseph. It's Vaye'asof instead of Yosef. So, and Vayas Mishteh, and he made a party. If you look in Genesis 40, that's exactly what Pharaoh does when he summons Jacob. It uses the exact same language of Vayas Mishteh, and he made a feast. So we have all this foreshadowing of Joseph, right? Who's like the main character, the beloved son. And you think, you're like, the Bible leads you to think that the point of the story, the point of the whole story of the Bible is going to be Jacob and Rachel. This is Jacob and Rachel's story. And Joseph is the telos, right? Joseph is the end of the story. And somehow, without even realizing it, the Bible puts you on a different path. But actually, it's going to be Leah's. In many respects, it's going to be Leah's story as well. And in fact, primarily Leah's story. That's what makes her so fascinating. She's the steadfast one. She's the one who perseveres despite being hated, despite being underappreciated, despite being in some ways abandoned, despite suffering. Like, she's the one who perseveres.
I think the other thing that's interesting about Jacob's story from a foundational point of view is that it's an unexpected marriage at first to Leah. So it's something that's unexpected. And then it goes on further that his first love is actually something that's going to require much more work than he expected. Jacob was willing to put in 7 years and ultimately get Rachel. But what will end up happening because of the nature of this world and the deception of his uncle is that he's going to be working 14 years to get his first true love.
Yep.
And so what does that tell us, even with the story of God? Because, so often throughout the Tanakh and more so even when Jesus starts teaching his disciples, the idea of the bridegroom, the bride, this idea of a wedding between God and his people is constantly kind of the metaphor that's being used. And this metaphor that God is in relationship with Israel is very, very clear, particularly in Hosea, where he talks about his wife and he talks about her whoredom and how they're almost estranged. But you see that God has this deep, deep love for his people. And, even looking at the fact that, in this story, God says, I'm not going to forsake you until I fulfill my promise. God's promise is to his people. And over again, as we track the text, God says, I will be your God and you will be my people. But at the same time, we see it's like this love story that's not quite complete. And we're seeing, as we work our way through this human story, we see this love story between God and his people. And then also, I think it's important to tap into this reality that even Isaiah exposes us to, that there's another set of people that are in this story, which is the non-Jewish people, which God hasn't forgotten about. It's not that God's not interested in those who are not Jewish, but more so that there's two different parties in this story. And, one pastor that I listen to, which I think he's incredible, his name's Pastor Randall Smith, he likens it to two marriages. God has a relationship with the Jewish people, but he also has a relationship with the non-Jewish people. And there's two marriages that are sort of taking place at the same time, which I think, Jacob's story reveals. He's got his first love and he's got his unexpected love. And so that's just like another sort of foreshadowing into the greater story that will start to unfold as we track through the story of the Tanakh, the Torah, and God's love for all humanity.
And think about what God says to Jacob as Jacob's on his way out, right? And it's a moment that you think is like a personal blessing for Jacob. So Genesis 28:14 says, and your children will be like the dust of the earth, and they'll spread out west and east and north and south. So you think that this is a blessing purely about Jacob and his family. And then it says, "V'nivrachu v'cha kol b'shpachot ha'adama uvzarecha," and all the families of the earth will be blessed through you and your children. That if Jacob, God is correcting Jacob and saying, or preemptively correcting Jacob and saying, if you think that this is just about you for your sake, and this is only a story with significance for you, you don't understand the story. And in order for the story to mean something, it has to have wider implications. And that's what we start to see.
Yeah, we see that there's a greater story going on, not even just for Jacob's lineage, but for all people. And so we get to this back and forth. Jacob ends up deciding to make a track. He wants to leave Laban. He's finally accepted the fact that it's time to go home, and begins this journey. But there's like a few things that sort of unfold before that happens. So we have Laban and Jacob coming head to head, and they make a covenant. But it's an interesting covenant because it's a covenant to stay away from each other, right? Which is like, hey, I can't trust you, you can't trust me, so how about we make peace and ultimately decide that you won't cross this side and I won't cross that side.
Yep.
Quite bizarre. But also, I think, true to human nature, there's just some people you need to make these sort of covenants with, where you're like, look, you stay on this side, I stay on that side. I think it's best for both of us. And Jacob will ultimately try and make his way home. This is where we find that once again, Rachel will show us that she's still very much anchored to the idea of, I think Leah sees the generational blessing. Leah kind of gets the idea where God is going in the story.
Yeah.
And Rachel steals these household gods. Now, one theory is that whoever has, she wanted Jacob to be the heir to Laban's fortune. And so she's still living in a very physical, earthly, no idea, and not really connecting with the God of Jacob, but more so still living in that reality of what her father was believing and these things, which is quite interesting because when Joseph comes along, he seems incredibly faithful in a lot of ways to trusting the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even though there's no direct conversation between God and Joseph throughout the entire biblical narrative. And obviously when we get there in a couple of episodes' time, we'll see that Joseph seems to be the character that you've been waiting for, that actually seems to be obedient to God, gets it right, and ultimately brings about a blessing to, not only his brothers, but also all the nations.
I mean, what's so fascinating is that it's funny. I never actually thought about it before. I've literally never thought about this until you just pointed it out. The covenant between Laban and Jacob is the literal opposite of the covenant between God and Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
It's a covenant to separate rather than to cleave to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's emblematic of the tension that defines Jacob's life with respect. And I think foreshadows kind of that sense of the relationship between Israel and the nations,
mm-hmm.
which is Jacob is constantly going back and forth between, and this we'll get into, more in the next episode when we talk about Joseph's name or Jacob's name change,
mm-hmm.
right? But Jacob constantly has this push and pull between his instinct to go behind people's back to outwit them,
mm-hmm.
and the kind of positive behavior of like standing your ground, standing up, and maintaining the courage of your convictions. And every time that Jacob tries to be too clever by half, it bites him, right? So when he tries to, like, when he's basically playing games with Laban for all of these years, then he ends up with, a bigger family than he bargained for. He ends up working for a lot longer than he planned.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately he ends with this, he like tries to sneak out under the cover of night.
Mm-hmm.
And he ends up, luckily, with this covenant to kind of just keep away from each other. And ultimately, that kind of is the end of the story of Laban. Like, you don't hear echoes of Laban's story later on in the biblical text. Whereas when Jacob confronts Esau and actually stands up to him, so that makes possible a future relationship. Now, that relationship won't always be pretty. The descendants of Esau will very much be in the lives of the descendants of Jacob. Sometimes they'll massacre them, but other times they'll be fellow countrymen together. To me, actually, the most amazing, the most overlooked ending of the story between Esau and Jacob. So in like very early Jewish tradition, like over 2,000 years ago, you actually have this in the Gospels as well. You have it in rabbinic literature in the Gospels. You have it you have hints of it in the Book of Jubilees and a lot of these like extra biblical books from thousands of years ago. The name Edom, right, like Esau's alternate name, like the Edomites, become associated with Rome. And the question is, why were the Romans associated with the Edomites? I mean, historically, that doesn't make any sense. They weren't Edomites, but why don't we call, like, instead of calling Rome the Edomites, we should call the Edomites the Edomites? What happened to the actual Edomites? The answer is they actually eventually become so close to the Jewish people that they fuse. The last time that we hear about the Edomites in Jewish history is actually in the work of Josephus. Josephus is the Jewish historian from 2,000 years ago. For our listeners, Jewish historian from 2,000 years ago. He's writing in Greek. He ends up chronicling that kind of period of the first century. We know so much about the first century in the land of Israel and its relationship with the Roman Empire because Josephus writes a great deal about it. Interestingly, from a historical standpoint, he's also the only extra biblical evidence. He's the only evidence outside the Gospels we have, but it's very secure evidence that we have for the existence of a historical Jesus, right? Because he talks about him. So Josephus is very important as a historian. And Josephus actually tells us what happens to the Edomites. He says, during the Jewish revolt against Rome, as the Romans are descending upon Jerusalem with certainly intent to bloodily suppress this revolt and eventually to sack Jerusalem and burn the temple to the ground. We've both done it. Like, you can many, many times. You can walk to Jerusalem and you can still see the stones that the Roman soldiers hurled from the top of the temple walls. Like, you can see the destruction to this day. You can walk into the city of David and you can actually take stones out of the layer of ash.
Yeah.
Like, you can literally touch ash from the fires.
I have some in my Bible.
Yeah, it's amazing, right?
Yeah.
Like, you can literally touch history from 2,000 years ago. So Josephus says that as the Romans are marching down to destroy Jerusalem, certainly to besiege it, to destroy Jerusalem, so the Jews are kind of like infighting. And you have different rival factions who are trying to defend Jerusalem, but each one hates the other and they're squabbling. All of a sudden, he says, a band of Edomites march up to the walls of Jerusalem in their armor. And they say, listen, we're sure that you guys all have different perspectives on what you should be doing here. And that's fine. But we have a common enemy to fight. We have an enemy that hates us, wants to kill us all, and is deeply immoral for the following reasons. And they were. I mean, these are like, the Romans are practicing like child exposure. They're like literally killing toddlers. Like, it's pretty bad. But they're like, this is an enemy that we have to fight. So you guys can fight as long as you want. But you know what we're going to do? We are going to stand in front of the walls of Jerusalem. And if the Romans want to get to you, they're going to have to go through us first. And they make this heroic stand in front of the walls of Jerusalem. And they really, truly, and they describe the Romans attacking not you, and we're standing up on your behalf. They're attacking us because they consider themselves part of the Jewish people at this point and part of the kingdom of the land of Judah and Israel. And it's amazing to think that the reason that the Edomites disappear is because they identify so closely with God's people that they become more, in some ways, indistinguishable from them. And so then Edom, the identity of Edom, because Esau represents something primal in the human condition, gets applied to Rome. And that's kind of important, right? You could find that everywhere from rabbinic literature to the book of Revelation, right? Edom and Esau survives in the human soul. But his physical descendants just go so hard to the mat for their brother that friendship becomes like true and real. And to me, that's the amazing, like, I'd never thought of this until you pointed it out. The worst thing that you can do with someone that you're having difficulty with, right? If it's somebody who's putting you in danger, then you have to stand up for yourself. And believe me, Jacob, we'll see. Like, Jacob stands up to Esau. It's not like Jacob is turning a blind eye to the threat that Esau represents. But the worst thing that you can do is just completely cut off. Like, if a person has wronged you, if a person has harmed you, if there's the potential to keep talking, you keep talking. Because if you have nothing left to say to somebody, that's really the end of a relationship. If you do have things to say to them, even if it's screaming and yelling and accusations, like, that's at least something. We'll see that later with Joseph and his brothers. The real breaking point between Joseph and his brothers is when the verse tells us in Genesis, they couldn't even speak to him for good or for evil. That was the moment that they decide to murder him, basically, and eventually to sell him to slavery. Jacob's able to have a relationship with Esau, ultimately, that comes to full fruition because they keep talking. And whereas Laban is out of the picture entirely. Like he basically disappears after this story.
Yeah, this is the last we'll hear of Uncle Laban.
Yeah.
He'll be dearly missed. All right. Well, let's. I think that will sum up this first episode, don't you think?
I mean, it really is.
Is there anything else you want to touch on?
It's like an insanely rich text. It's like absolutely crazy. Oh, you know what? The last thing I wanted to point out, just because you mentioned it before, the relationship between Jacob and Rachel. So starts off great. Love at first sight. They're totally in love. Then there's struggles. Rachel and Jacob can't have children together.
Yep.
And Rachel comes to Jacob in that moment of pain and she cries. And what's Jacob's response? He kind of dismisses her, right? And how does he dismiss her? If you look in chapter 30, verse 1, right? So it says, and Rachel saw that she and Jacob couldn't give birth. So and Rachel was jealous of her sister, and she said to Jacob, "Give me children," using the exact same words, right? She says, "Hava li vanim," give me children, just like Jacob says to Laban, "Hava et ishti," give me my wife, and then ends up getting Leah. She says, "Give me children, v'imai meta anochi," and if not, I'll die. And what does Jacob say? So Jacob is angry with Rachel. And he says, "What am I God that I'm the one preventing you from having children?" And he basically tells her to get lost. And that is one of the most remarkable failures of Jacob's life, just not being there for his wife who's in pain. So if you fast forward all the way to Jeremiah 31. This is like the end. This is basically the end of the biblical story chronologically.
Rachel crying.
Yeah, exactly. Rachel, we get this vision that Jeremiah has as the Babylonians come to destroy the first temple, and they've successfully destroyed Solomon's temple. They've sacked Jerusalem. They're burning it to the ground, and they're dragging the Jews out of the Holy Land. They'll be restored, but this is a moment of terrible pain. So we get that vision that you just referenced of Jeremiah says Rachel is crying over her children being torn away from the land. And what does God respond to Rachel when he says, "I'll comfort you"? So if you look in Jeremiah 31 verse 15, it says, thus says the Lord, prevent your voice from crying and your eyes from tears, because there will be a payment ultimately for your work, says God, and they'll return to the land of the enemy. That verb that God uses for stop crying, stop, is the exact same verb, and it's a very rare one. The exact same biblical Hebrew word, manah, that Jacob uses to essentially yell at Rachel and says, "Stop crying." Because when Jacob says to Rachel, all the way back in Genesis 30, "Stop crying," what he means is, "I can't help you," or "I won't help you." When God says to Rachel, "Stop crying," he says, "Stop crying because I have you. I'll hold your hand." And what does he specifically say? He says something strange, right? He says, if you look in chapter Jeremiah 31, chapter 15, he says, "Hold back your voice from crying," which is itself a very odd phrase, and it's only there because God is using the same words that Jacob used to Rachel. And then God says,
What chapter was that in that Jacob says that to Rachel? 31?
In Genesis 30. Verse 2.
Verse 2, okay.
Yeah. Right? So he says, and God was, and Jacob was angry with Rachel, and he says, "Am I in place of God that I have prevented you from having children?" That word for prevent is manah. It's the same word that God uses to say prevent yourself from crying. It's a very strange word to use in both cases, right? Jeremiah would only use it because he knows that it's already been used in Genesis.
Right. So Jeremiah taps into this because the children of Israel will be slaughtered during the Babylonian exile.
And the children of Israel are on their way out. The place where this vision takes place is in the city of Ramah, which the Book of Kings and the Book of Jeremiah tells us was the gathering center where the Babylonians basically like put the Jews in like a holding camp while they deported them, right? And it's in that spot that Jeremiah has this vision of Rachel crying for her children.
Interesting.
And then God says, "Prevent your voice from crying." which is again directly a play on Genesis. And then he says, Ki yesh sachar lefulaseichnu Hashem, because there will be a reward for your work. That's a weird thing to say. What work is Rachel doing? So the idea of reward for your work, that the word for reward is sachar. That word literally means payment. Where else do we see that word? That's the key word that appears over and over and over and over again in Genesis 29 and 30.
With Laban.
It's what Laban it's what Jacob is asking for from Laban. Give me my payment.
Yeah, for my labors.
Exactly. It's the same thing. So God is playing on that and saying, listen, human beings, at the end of the day, even Jacob, the great Jacob, at the end of the day, people come and people go, but my promise is forever.
And in the Gospel of Matthew, obviously, that quote from Jeremiah, which has been quoted from Genesis, is used where it's in reference to the children being killed in the first century by King Herod, trying to remove this messianic seed promise. And then God says, but when Herod died, behold, an angel of Adonai appears in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those seeking you, the child's life, are now dead. I kind of find it interesting because it's like Jacob's out of the land, but about to make his way back. Jeremiah is talking about a people that are in the land, but about to go
leave.
out. And now Matthew is talking about, a baby Jesus with his mother and father in Egypt going back into the land. So it's kind of like we're coming back in, we're going back out, we're coming back in.
Look, this story that we just read, this is the foundational story of civilization. Like, this is the story of promise.
And it's important to note that it's all anchored and connected to a land. The main thing that we have to remind ourselves of with Jacob's story and God's promises is it's a land, descendants, his divine presence and protection, a universal blessing, and a covenant renewal. A confirmation that the promises that God made, even though they don't look like they're coming to pass right now, are being reconfirmed and renewed generationally through, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, And so for Christians, I think that's why it's so important that, these genealogies begin the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel, we find another one in the Gospel of Luke, where it's important to understand that this is a generational story of God fulfilling his promise that he started way back with Abraham and is slowly making its way out. Isaac understands that. Jacob's starting to understand that. And now God has said, you know what? It's time to go. Leave this place and return to the land, return to Bethel ultimately. And God says, I am the God that you saw in Bethel, and the God that you made, you anointed a stone with. So now God is saying, your time is up. Come back to this place. So whatever task you had from this point to this point, it's finished. It's now it's time to move on to the next chapter of your story. So I'll finish with this. I think this is a good little story to finish with in light of that, with what we talked about earlier with Jacob and this marker moment for him, saying this is this is a marker moment where he says, okay, God is now confirming that he's on this journey with me. As you're aware, and people may not be aware, outside of Israel, I was given an incredible privilege to light the Independence Day torch.
By the way, the first
non-Israeli,
person
non-Jew
outside of Israel ever to get this honor.
Ever.
My man. It's
Huge.
like incredible.
Yeah, it's like...
By the way, just to say, trying to walk 2 feet in the land of Israel with Nate is the most infuriating thing on the planet because you feel like a nobody.
Well, yeah, and plus it's...
We were eating at a restaurant in Tel Aviv, and literally people kept coming up to our table, like sending food and drinks and saying things. At a certain point, it got to the point where someone comes up to our table and with no preamble, just says, I just want to thank you for everything you've done for our people. And I'm like, are you talking to him or me?
It's kind of, it becomes awesome. Awkward for me because I just feel like I'm doing what God has called me to do. Yeah. Right. It's kind of like,
so that's what people see. People relate to that. It's authentic.
Yeah. So the day that I actually got to light the torch, the day that I got given this award and privilege, I went to Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. They had a ceremony and they gave me a plaque, which kind of signifies that I've been chosen among a small few to be given this incredible honor to light the torch on Independence Day. And they have 12 different torches that are lit to represent the 12 tribes. It's all very, very symbolic. After the event was over, I thought to myself, you know what, it's kind of interesting because it's been about 7 years since I first came into the land, right? So I was like, okay, 7 years, that's kind of like, that's a biblical number. So I went back through my phone, and the day that I actually got given this award on Mount Herzl, where I was, doing the light torching ceremony, was a pre-record. So it was before the actual event, which is on the 14th of May. It was on the 8th of May. So out of curiosity, I thought I'll go and just see, out of curiosity, when was the first time I ever came to Israel, right? So I'm scrolling through my phone history, and, thankfully that Instagram was up at the time. So I jump on my Instagram and I'm scrolling through looking for the exact date. And I remember the very first time I came to Israel was 2017. So I was like, I know it's 7 years, but I'm just curious to see like how close I was to like this date. I opened up my phone to the picture that I'd posted the first day I landed in Israel. It was late in the afternoon. I made a dash to Caesarea Maritima because I wanted to get a sunset. I was so excited to be in the Holy Land after reading the entire Bible cover to cover in 28 days and just wanting to really soak it up. And so I wrote this caption. I said, "This journey begins with a sunset." Trevor Bramlett, who was the friend I was with, and I find ourselves on the shores of the Mediterranean giving thanks to God. Caesarea Maritima, hashtag, because we used to use those, Jesus, hashtag purpose tool Holy Land, right? That was on the 8th of May 2017. The 8th of May 2017. It was exactly 7 years to the day.
Unbelievable.
From my first time in Israel to this opportunity to light the torch and be a part of this nation in such a huge way. I was shocked. If it was the same week,
that's insane.
If it was the same week, I would have been impressed. If it was the same month, I would have been impressed. It would have been enough, as we say during Passover. Dayenu, right? But it was the same day, the 8th of May, and it blew me away to the point where I was like, wow, God is doing something in my time which I'm unaware of. When I first landed in Israel, I had no desire to do tours. I had no thought in my head that I was going to stand with a nation that was going to be once again persecuted and targeted and vilified for only simply existing and defending themselves. I never thought any of these things were going to happen. But God had a plan, and God had a purpose for that journey. And the fact that it happened on the same day was enough for me to go, wow, here's two bookends. Here are two marker moments in my life where you said, I'm going to start a journey with you. You're in the land. It's a purpose tour. It's you're giving thanks, which is the same thing that Jacob does when he's like, wow, like I'm really like, if you bring me food and bring me, some clothes and return me to my, to the peace of my father's house, then that's enough for me. And then to go 7 years on this journey, again, biblical number, 7 years, I really feel like God completed something. And if anything, to those listening right now, I want to encourage you with this. What could God do with you today over a 7-year period if you committed yourself? If today was the day where you said, you know what? I've been lackluster in my relationship with God. I've put my spiritual soul aside to live out the fleshly life like Esau, but now I want to actually live for something which is far greater than myself, which is generational, which is connecting to the Creator, knowing that there is a stairway and an access to God. What could God do with me over the next 7 years? And I would say that that's what I'm thinking now. Like, I feel like God's completed one task, but as we see with Jacob's journey, there's still more to come. There's still more to do. And the question is, what could God do with you if you were obedient, dedicated, and persistent, like Jacob was in his pursuit of his wife, his love, his pursuit of really living out what that blessing really means in a physical realm with a spiritual Creator?
there is no way to improve upon that ending. So another perfect episode.
There we go. Done.